Thank you very much. We have three very excellent presentations from three center powers regarding U.S. and China perspective and position and policy in the South China Sea. We can see in the first paper we have different perspective within China and regarding the situation in the South China Sea, and somewhat a unified perspective regarding the sources of tension. In the third paper, we have Dr. Hamari discuss about the sources of behavior of China, because he looked at the internal and domestic issue within China. And we have Zach Copper paper from U.S. perspective on China and on South China Sea from different perspective on the policy and also scenarios. So in combined three papers, I have a quite pessimistic view. First view is that two papers on China argue that sources of tension is not because of China, because of other. And then sources of assertive behaviors is because of domestic issues. That means China will continue with their policy in the near future. That from other side, in the second section, in this morning, we can see perspective from Southeast Asian country, for example, on see Chinese activity assertive in South China Sea. But from U.S. perspective, we don't expect any change in U.S. policy in South China Sea. That means in the near future, China will continue with expansion, and the U.S. cannot do anything to prevent. So the ball is on the hand of other Southeast Asian and other countries. So just one note. Second observation is that we can see today morning and also in this session, all countries have policy of so-called defensive and reactive to other activity, and no one take proactive or offensive action. So we have a strange picture. Everyone defensive, but incident and tension happen in the South China Sea. A general comments about three papers is just focus very closely and very carefully on perspective from U.S. and China. But I would like to, if we can have a more focus on interactions, give both on action-reaction cycle or cooperation and competition aspect of two. We have two players, but we don't see the game. They play with each other here. So if three speakers, three writers focus more on interaction among tools, this must be better. Specifically on each paper, on the first paper, Professor Yan Zhang explained China behavior from China's perspective. As I mentioned, China blame other countries on a similar unified view within China about the sources of tension because of others, because of U.S. China is just reactive to other country activities. So my question here is that view how much reflecting the true analysis of Chinese analysis, or just a part of propaganda game in presenting view for international audience and blame other countries for tension in the South China Sea. if we can have more diversified view within China, I think China have to have some internal discussion very intensively. Why this situation happened like that, and why situation now unfavorable for China, and they have to look at what they have done wrong, or just everything they have done is right, right? And second issue is that regarding to that is maybe if they have unified view about the sources of tension, it's because of other countries. So the issue here, I think the real issue is not a analysis of behavior, but the real issue is about claim of parties. When China have a expansion claim about 90%, right, 80% South China Sea, but not based on international law or UNCLOS. So they will see every activity of other countries within, for example, within 200 nautical miles of Malaysia, but within China 9 dotted line, and they see that activity as assertive, and they have to react. So the nature of activity that can be characterized as assertive or reactive depend on the common understanding from us about the common framework, common understanding about international law, what we can claim, what we cannot claim, so that we can compare with activity of parties, so we can characterize who assertive and who reactive. Other comments about how China will formulate policy in dealing with the current situation. If we can have more about inside China discussion on how they formulate policy. We have Professor Zhang provides a very rich picture about China perspective on the situation, but how China formulate policy and react to that policy is much more welcome. On the second paper about U.S. perspective, we see for U.S. perspective, accumulation, integration, containment, and balancing. But I think it's mainly focused on China, not on the South China Sea. What we need is South China Sea approach or policy or strategy is depend on the household, but more on the South China Sea, where the U.S. have proactive or reactive or engagement or disengagement to the South China Sea issue. Because South China Sea is not only relating to China, right? Without China, U.S. still have something to maintain in the South China Sea. On the issue of where the gray zone coercion can be deterred is a very good issue to be discussed, and I think it needs to be intensively analyzed. Here, one issue is that when Jack Cooper listed some past issue, right? If we listed past incident, we have a lot of incident. You have about 10, and China can win only 2 incidents. But if we listed also fishing activity, oil and gas activity, is military expansion in the South China Sea, China can win 90% of the cases. Also, on the one option for deterrence from U.S. side is that Professor Dr. Cooper mentioned about possibility of U.S. policy of punishment. My question: could you elaborate more what kind of punishment the U.S. can do in dealing with China regarding this kind of deterrence? On future scenarios, I am a little bit doubt about the capability of the U.S. in deterring China activity if they decide to conduct reclamation, land reclamation in Scarborough Shoal. We can use the word land here because Scarborough Shoal is the rock. So what option for U.S.? Can U.S. send ship, send aircraft to prevent China? I don't think. If the incident, if conflict happens there, it will not be in the U.S. interest. Another scenario is how the U.S. react to China's new occupation. A lot of unoccupied feature is Bradley. And if China, we know very well that DOC is not legally binding, and if China acknowledges DOC and they occupy new non-occupied feature, what the U.S. can do in the South China Sea. On Professor Sarah Hamari paper, I think, yeah, exploring domestic issue and different interest group and competition, or so-called defragmentation, transformation of China domestic issue to explain behaviors is one way to find the real picture. But I think it's just a part of the issue. Because we can see some activities, cost tension was very well coordinated and centralized from Beijing or from standing Politburo member, Politburo. For example, oil rig deployment, for example, land reclamation, for example, reaction to arbitration case. That is very well coordinated and centralized. And second issue is maybe that explanation was true before Xi Jinping came into power. But after Xi Jinping came into power, we see a little bit more centralized policy of China in foreign policy in general and in South China Sea in particular. And the last comment is about the term. In the first page, you see you describe a lot of incidents such as fishing, large-scale land reclamation, so on, happen in the high sea. That is not high sea. That is within exclusive economic zone or continental shelf of other parties. So thank you very much.
Dr. Tran, thank you very much for those comments. I will give each of the paper givers 1 minute at the end of this session to make a summary statement which might include some responses to Dr. Tran's observations. In the meantime, we have about 15 minutes for questions. So what I will do, I think, in line with previous practice, is to collect together 2 or 3 questions and then ask the panelists to respond to them. Can I ask you, please, if you have the call for a question, to identify yourself and perhaps to identify the member of the panel that you want to ask the question of. I think there may be microphones floating around, so if you can take the call, sir, but if you could just wait for the microphone.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. That has been fascinating discussions. And I have a question for both Dr. Janzan and Zach. And first of all, I was listening to the presentation of Dr. Janzan with close attention. And with regard to arbitration award, I recall, you said something to the effect that there was a sweeping victory for the Philippines, and there are some academic critical about non-participation of China in the proceedings. I want you to, elaborate it on that, especially what kind of internal discussions you had vis-a-vis this arbitration case, because the other side of the coin of this sweeping victory is one might call humiliating defeat for the other party. So if that is the case, what kind of self-reflections did the Chinese people have on this case? That is my first question. I was, again, very much impressed by succinct and articulate presentation by Zach, as always. And well, when it comes to lack of U.S. strategy toward China, I don't blame you, because according to Professor Hameli, there seems to be lack of consistency on the part of China as well. So if China keeps on changing, if China has so many faces to turn to, how can you come up with one specific strategy? But that said, my question to you, Zach, is I think this includes Australia and Japan as well. As far as we are concerned, there seems to be a divide between the business community and the strategic community when it comes to views on China. Japan is no exception. In that regard, how does this slowing down of the Chinese economy affect US views toward China? Is this going to lead to the sort of convergence of various views on the country? That is my question. Thank you.
Okay, our second is Chris Roberts, and third is just here.
Thank you, and thank you for three very interesting papers. I have a very short statement followed by a question. I remember speaking with some old colleagues, one particular colleague in Singapore, who I've known for a long time, has good connections with government. And I remember his response at the time of the Scarborough Shoal incident, and that the Singapore, from his words, the Singapore perspective was that the US was caught off guard and was in fact embarrassed when the Philippines raised the treaty obligations. And so if we actually do like a content analysis and go through speeches, etc., over the years, if you start back in 2012, the American statements are the treaty does not apply or extend to disputed rocks and shoals. But when we see the various developments over the last couple of years, there's been a gradual evolution to a stronger, and I guess I make this comment because it goes to the heart of the topic set for this issue. And my question, I guess, is is this perhaps a strategic gamble? I think this links to one of the earlier statements that China has been acting on the basis that it believes the US can't afford to act. And if so, does it then follow that this is actually a dispute in the South China Sea between China and the ASEAN claimant states, that any great power rivalry is actually a secondary outcome from the first strategy as such? But it's all about the South China Sea, it's all about the claimant states.
Okay, last question in this group.
Andrew O'Neill, Griffith University. Thank you very much for three really super presentations. Just a couple of questions for Zach Cooper, but I want to preface that by, I guess, an observation in relation to Donald Trump, and everyone's got an observation in relation to Donald Trump. Mine is as follows. You made the claim that we have no idea how Donald Trump would behave or act in the region. I think we've got a pretty good idea. He sees alliances as protection rackets. He's been very upfront about that, very consistent. He's got an inclination to do deals with authoritarian regimes. At best, I think we can probably hope for an offshore balancing strategy, but I think a lot of what we see in here with Donald Trump has echoes of isolation is imminent. So I actually think it's pretty clear where US strategy would track. You would actually have a strategy under Donald Trump. Question I've got is twofold, I guess, is how would you characterise US views in DC mainly, but more broadly, about the contribution of allies towards towards US strategy of pushing back against China, and particularly, although not exclusively, in relation to freedom of navigation operations, FONOPS? And the second is, if you don't have a strategy, should we be concerned about that as allies?
Okay, Jim.
Okay, thanks for the excellent question. And so the first question is about whether there is a internal discussion or internal difference in Chinese view about the South China Sea in general and the arbitration course. And firstly, I would like to say there is a different view within China. But that difference is, within the overall consensus that China had a historical right and claim to the waters and islands in the South China Sea. And not many Chinese, that's a general view, but there is a difference about how to defend and or enforce China's claim. So there are two different issues. So firstly, there are two major debates in China in the literature on South China Sea study. Firstly, is that whether to clarify the 9-dashed line or not. And for a long time, China, until now, China maintained a very ambiguous, position on what are the legal meaning of the 9-dashed line. Does that mean territorial line, and which means all the water, including feature within the 9-dashed line, was China's territory, or it's just the line for including the land feature within the water, or it's the what China claim within the 9-dashed line are just land feature plus the whatever maritime right entitled and unclosed, or are there something else? I think so. For a very long time, there is a debate about this and about whether to clarify or not. And over the last few years, there is a growing number of Chinese scholars and argue that it's time to clarify the 9-dashed line. But even if they argue for clarify the 9-dashed line, because previously, and the argument is that because the South China Sea dispute is very difficult, and when other claimant state hasn't clarified their own claim, and it's too early and premature for China to put its card on the table. So that's one of the major considerations, not to clarify the 9-dashed line, and unless all other claimant states make clear what they claim for. So that's the first argument by people who do not want to clarify. The second is that it's they actually don't know what the 9-dashed line means when it firstly was drawn during the before 1949. But gradually there is a consensus now that which also reflect in the statement issued by Chinese Foreign Ministry after the ruling, that what China claimed and in the South China Sea are all the island groups and all the including the some area called internal water, plus the maritime area attached to this land feature, and plus historical right. And what is historical right is not clear. It's basically and refers to the historical activity and for Chinese people to undertake economic activity, fishing, etc., etc. So so that is the situation. So that's the first debate, and there is not a very controversial in China, and but the government hasn't make a take action to. But they are gradually, as I said, after the ruling, the statement made by the Chinese Foreign Ministry, I think it's clarify China's claim and to a greater extent than before, even if they didn't say that's the legal meaning of 9-dashed line. The second debate within China about South China Sea dispute is about whether to participate the arbitration tribunal or not. The great majority is China shouldn't participate, but there is a small minority of Chinese scholars arguing that China should participate, and for two reasons. Partly, they feel China had a strong case to make, and it's not necessary China will lost the it's strong case to make against whether the tribunal has authority over the case. And secondly, even if and China do not succeed, but that's still and could gain for China's international image. But for those scholars, I think Professor Lin Bing and is one of the scholars. He is a professor of law at Sydney University, and he is one of the scholars arguing China should participate, even if he's not in China. Okay, but anyway, but those Chinese scholars who publicly call for China's participation in the arbitration tribunal, they changed their position after the ruling. And one of the scholars, which is quite vocal from the Chinese Academy of Social Science, recently published in the Financial Times public letter, an open letter to President Obama. And in the letter, and he questioned the legality and the, the intention of United States and the role United States played in the arbitration process. And in the letter, he actually said he is widely perceived as a one of the few Chinese scholars who had a moderate and relatively neutral position regarding the South China Sea dispute. Is the Chinese scholar, but now he changed his mind. He published this in the Financial Times, the Chinese version. So that is the situation and in China. What are the public's reaction to the ruling? And I think after the tribunal, after the ruling delivered, in July, and the Chinese government started a huge media war. But that media war actually only partly targeting external audience. And the main focus is actually domestic audience. I think they are very successful. They convinced, and of course in China's current political environment, they convinced successfully the Chinese public that the tribunal ruling is illegal, and it was plotted by the United States, and China made the right decision not to participate, and China will do whatever. So I think they did this well, and but they did this well partly because in the current political environment there are very hard for dissenting view to be expressed, but also partly because, as I said earlier, even people who are critical of government position previously now change their position. So there are even less different view. So in that case, and I think regardless of whatever the cost China paid for its international image domestically, the government actually generate sufficient public support and endorsement. Thank you.
On Ambassador Yamagami's points, just two quick thoughts. The first is I think it's hard to develop a U.S. strategy when China's changing. You see this in the U.S. embrace of the new model of great power relations and then running away from it, right? The embrace or the running away from AIIB. When China changes its stances, you see great variation in U.S. responses, I think in part because China's stance empowers certain elements in our community that have different views and disempowers others. I think if there is a business slowdown in China, what that effectively does is it empowers those who are optimistic that the power trajectory can be managed. And those people, in my mind, are the people who support a policy of containment or the people that support a policy of integration. So I think those are two very different directions, but I think those are the elements in our system that are empowered if there is a slowdown economically in China. Chris Roberts on the Philippines, I don't have a direct answer to your question, but I would just note, if you want to see the U.S. confusion about whether to be specific or ambiguous about its mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, go watch a congressional hearing from about a month or two ago with two people that I greatly respect, Abe Denmark and Colin Willett, who were asked the question over and over and over again, would the United States come to the aid of the Philippines in a South China Sea crisis under the treaty? Right, the treaty says in the Pacific. Are features in the South China Sea included in the Pacific? In 1979 and 1999, the United States has written letters that said that they were. The only answer that you would hear in that hearing was that the U.S. commitment to the Philippines is ironclad. And when asked again what that meant, they said, well, it's ironclad. And they said, does it apply to these features? And they said, it's ironclad. They couldn't answer the question. And I think that's emblematic of sort of, frankly, our level of strategic thought on this question, right? So my view is, yes, the treaty requires the United States to come to the Philippines' aid in a crisis over Second Thomas, which would qualify as an armed attack. I'd rather tell the Chinese that beforehand rather than not telling the Chinese that before and then realizing that we have to get involved after. And then finally, on Andrew O'Neill's point, I completely agree with you on Donald Trump, actually. There's some really good thinking on this by a colleague at the Brookings Institution, Tom Wright, who's read everything that Trump has ever written. And yeah, so if you want to look in an almost scholarly way, it is worth reading, and I think there are some clear and coherent points. I think what's hard is it's not clear that he has a strong worldview on, say, South China Sea. I can tell you what he'd do on Japan and Korea. I just don't have any idea on South China Sea issues. I can imagine him being incredibly nationalistic or incredibly transactional. And they lead in two totally different directions. So I don't know on that point. On the more conventional policy community and its view of allies in its Asia strategy, I think there's a lot more we could do. For example, the Defense Department's main response is the offset, right? The offset strategy. Well, that's supposed to make use of U.S. asymmetric advantages against Chinese asymmetric disadvantages. So one asymmetric advantage the United States has is its allies, but they haven't really been consulted on the offset from everything that I've heard, which I think is telling about our level of thought on incorporating allies really into our thinking. On FONOPS, very briefly, my view is that actually, if what we're trying to do is deter a specific action by indicating a credible commitment, by accepting either costly, by making a costly action or accepting reputational costs, audience costs, I don't believe that FONOPS do either of those, especially not innocent passage FONOPS in the cases that they've been done.
I haven't been asked the question.
So you're saying,
Well, let's see if we can whip you up a question. I'm very conscious of the time. I'll allow two more questions. Sir?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the great insights. I have two questions, one for Dr. Chang and then one for Dr. Cooper. I'd start with Dr. Chang. About the concept of core national interests, my limited understanding about core national interests is that there's no compromise, no negotiation, no discussion. And I think this would explain China's position in relation to Tibet and Xinjiang. So is this concept of national interest over time expanded to include South China Sea? And if yes, how would you go about reconciling this with Chinese policy pronouncements to the effect that shelving sovereignty disputes, pursuing joint development, or sharing the South China Sea as a regional commons? And also, consequently, in relation to that, how will you go about selling this idea to your domestic public? My question to Dr. Cooper. There seem to be, to my limited understanding, some divergence in terms of how U.S. responds to certain Chinese actions in maritime East Asia. When China declared an air defense identification zone in the East China Sea, American response was swift and resolute. Next day, they flew B-52 bombers. In South China Sea, the construction of artificial islands took not days, not weeks, but months. But there seemed to be a lackluster, less robust U.S. response. How would you account for this differential in terms of approach? Thank you.
I'm starting to feel like a jack in the box. I'll take one further questioner who has one question. Okay, you had your chance. John.
Okay, thanks for the question. With regarding why the South China Sea is a core China's national interest, actually that is a very interesting question, and the answer is that yes or no, because on the one hand, China has never publicly and stated that South China Sea is a core national interest, despite of there is a report by the New York Times in 2010. And later, there is a lot of debate about whether actually China said that or not, and whether the core national interest term was used refers to South China Sea or about other things in the meeting with U.S. senior official. And but there was no record on any Chinese leader and the Chinese senior official which say South China Sea is a core national interest. And but in comparison, the spokesperson of China's foreign minister say very clearly the East China Sea dispute is China's core national interest. And that statement was on the Chinese foreign ministry's website. So that is the difference. And so that is refers to the issue is that the Chinese government hasn't, decided on that issue yet, and that also refers to the question, and also in my reading about the South China Sea debate within China, is that actually there is some debate about how important the South China Sea to China, and that's an issue. And apparently now it's become more important, largely not because of the material the resource or etc., but largely because of the U.S. intervention and these things. But the answer could be yes, because China does have a clear definition of core national interest in China's foreign policy white paper, China's Peaceful Development, released in 2005 and 2011, and which listed 6 core national interests, including sovereignty, territorial integrity, and China political system, etc., etc. So South China Sea as a territorial dispute is related to the territorial integrity. So in that case, China can always interpret South China Sea as a core national interest. But what should be noted is that there is some misunderstanding outside China about the meaning of the core national interest, and some new development within China about how to protect China's core national interest, because currently the standard interpretation is that if China defines something as a core national interest, which means China will use military means or coercive means, threat or the use of force to defend that interest. But that's not necessarily true, because within China there is currently the new debate about core national interest. They are very important, fundamentally important to China's national interest, but they doesn't necessarily mean they have to be defended in military means or in confrontational means. There are different ways to protect core national interest in different manner. So in that case, for the South China Sea, regardless whether it's a core national interest or not, we still can see some conciliatory approach by China and some confrontational moves by China, and depends on the situation. And it is not necessarily when China defined the South China Sea as a core national interest, and its policy and approach will be outright confrontational, no flexibility. So that's the situation. The second thing is that China can at any time and downplay the significance of South China Sea, and depends on I think the circumstances in the South China Sea.
Just very briefly, Professor Pillow, I thought your presentation this morning was outstanding. So just one quick response on why the U.S. has responded firmly in some cases and less firmly in others. I think there's basically one factor that tells you how firmly the U.S. will respond in most South China Sea situations, and that's whether China has been contesting rules, norms, or physical control, or trying to exploit rules, norms, or physical control that already exist. So take an example of like the impeccable incident. contesting of U.S. Operations with P-8s and other surveillance aircraft, contesting Senkaku, Diaoyu Islands, Second Thomas Shoal. Those, in my mind, are some of the cases where the U.S. has stood up most firmly. And the other cases, Spratly Islands, land reclamation, I think that's exploiting control the Chinese already have, and the U.S. thought there was very little it could do, and so it didn't try to do much. On the East China Sea ADIZ, I think it's twofold. The U.S. realized that it couldn't stop China from announcing the ADIZ in the first place, so it didn't try. But it wanted to stop China from contesting actual fly-throughs of those areas. So it reacted firmly afterwards, but not particularly firmly beforehand.
Thank you, Zach. In bringing this session to a close, I'm going to change the rules because I can, and give Shaha 2 minutes to talk about anything he wants to talk about.
Well, given the opportunity, I'll just go back to the point that Tui made in his comments, and especially the issue. Sorry, just on that. Yeah. So, firstly, I agree with your first point that it's not all of what's going on. I think it's important to know that. I think the point that we're trying to make is it's an important part of the picture that gets ignored, or if not ignored, then totally shoehorned into existing explanations. But it is actually an important factor in the broader set of dynamics that shape this part of the world. And we would like to understand that. And we're also seeking to understand in our analysis the instances in which this kind of fragmentation does not occur at all, or where it doesn't play a big part in China's foreign security policies. So yeah, but clearly because we're making a point that is somewhat, I guess, different to the normal way in which these ways are understood, these elements were emphasized in the paper just to show their significance. The point about Xi and that there's been more centralization is actually quite contentious. There's some analysts that have argued that, but there's other analysts that have argued and shown, like Linda Jacobson, for example, who's actually shown that actually in some ways not much has changed. And to some extent also, there are limits. I don't want to get into it too much here because that's a very difficult discussion, but there are some limits on Xi's capacity to actually force all actors that act in this part of the world or in other parts of China's foreign security policy to actually toe a very narrow line. And in a recent paper, she argued with a co-author that if he went too far, he could actually face significant revolt internally. And I think he has some awareness of his own limitations within the party state as well. Although he may have obviously overstepped the mark in some cases. And we don't know whether that's going to happen or not, but it's not a one-man band. And there are significant limitations there. But yeah, there's no time to really talk about this right now, but just as a general point. Thanks.
Okay. That brings to an end this session. Can you please join me in thanking all our speakers?